things you can see in our space is when somebody says you're taking a vote for Wall Street, they're not voting for that. They've got to sneak in riders and provisions in the dead of night because they can't get it done during the day. And that's why doing what we do in each of our spheres and the overlap is so important. Because
Or they block regulations. Like in the book, I think I said that as of the end of 2017, a third of the regulations that were supposed to be written for Dodd-Frank, which again was passed in 2010, so 2017 is a lot of time, still hadn't been written. They were bottled up because they were being lobbied up. Is that still about the?
It's roughly.
Well,
right.
now they're being written back. You know, they're being pulled back. But
See, I think that part of like the theory of change discussion here depends upon how you actually see members of Congress, and if you see them as basically corrupt people who are here to feather their own beds and then cash out to K Street, then that's one view. But we did just in 2017 alone, did 170 meetings on the Hill, 170 different congressional offices, 70% of which were with Republican offices. My board member JB just got done doing 5 or 6 today with various members of Congress. What I've seen with members, both former and current, is actually that they are mainly decent people. You might disagree with them on policy, but they are mainly decent people stuck inside of a horrible system. And where you see this the most, and this is what gives me the most amount of hope, is with new members of Congress. What happens is they arrive in Washington, they believe that they are there to legislate, to talk about policy and evidence, not just influence. And instead, they're immediately told by leadership, hit the phones and start fundraising, because you've got to raise at least $3 million for the re-elect, you've got to deliver X amount of money to the RNC or the DNC, you've got to set up a leadership PAC, and by the way, there are probably a couple of super PACs that you could be helpful with too. And what happens is that, like a smoker who's taking the first couple of puffs of a cigarette, they're choking on it. They start coughing, and they say, this is not why I'm here. This is not right. And they have an important moral reaction that occurs at that moment. And then what happens is that eventually over time they do start setting up the leadership PAC, and they start doing the fundraising, they can begin imagining being a committee chair, and they're a part of the system. So part of it is to get them when they're still fresh. And what you see, whether it's Mike Gallagher, who's a Republican member of Congress, 36 years old, Marine Corps, Princeton grad from Green Bay, Wisconsin, or whether you talk about a guy like Derek Kilmer on the Democratic side, who is one of the most thoughtful people I've ever met. He worked in a highly functional state legislature in Washington before he came to DC. He saw how governing actually worked. That whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, what both of these folks, what bonds them together, and the reason why we're working with both of them, is because they both are still choking on the smoke. And that's increasingly what, where we're finding the most amount of traction.
That's certainly true. The guy I wrote about who, with the I don't give a, Post-it note, he feels imprisoned.
Yep.
And, I said, well, why don't you say something about it? Well, he said, I'm getting close to where I want to, but they're trapped. And I actually, I am really hopeful. I think that that you're all right in the sense that sooner or later things are just going to snap, because they do. And when they do, it's going to be because of people like these folks who have stayed at it when everybody else thought they were just wasting their time or couldn't get a job doing something else. That it's because of all the work they've done that the country's going to be prepared to be, it's going to have the information and the direction that it needs to make the kinds of changes we're talking about.
Though we don't have all the information, because part of the fundraising frenzy is that dark money groups, super PACs, and non-disclosing nonprofits may drop millions of dollars.
Right, but you do stuff like go to office buildings and look at building directories and find links. It's really, really great stuff. So let me ask you each one more question.
Can I just quickly add on what Steve said? Because
we're running out of time.
Well, I was going to say, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse was actually here. You talk about good policy. He was here for about 20 minutes. I'd be remiss if I didn't say he was here. But, you're talking about politicians trapped in a bad system. very good, hardworking, earnest people. I think Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from
Yeah.
Rhode Island, who actually wrote a
Wrote
similar
a very
book about
good
a year
book,
ago called Captured,
Yeah.
was here. And in our space, the problems you identified are compounded because of the unbelievable lack of knowledge and sophistication about the economy and finance. People think Wall Street is this thing up there in the financial system they don't understand. And so they become actually dependent on lobbyists because
Totally.
we don't pay staff, we don't pay members, we don't give them enough staff. So to get anything done when they're not raising money and they're in the room, they got a few staff who are, and I was staff, so all staff are really good, but there's only so many of them.
No, there's this story I tell where the most indefensible tax loophole, probably can all agree, is the carried interest loophole, where if you were your carried interest in a private equity fund or hedge fund is treated as capital gains. Anyway, when Dodd-Frank was being debated, as you well know, they tried to reform that, and whatever the trade association is for private equity funds, I'm sure you can, you know all those guys in your sleep. They produced this wonderful, this really glossy bound thing. I think they got McKinsey or someone to do it. They got a consulting firm to do it, and it had all these graphs and all these tables, and basically, if the carried interest loophole were not preserved, 2/3 of America was going to be out of work. And they had all these graphs, and when I looked at the footnotes, it was all bullshit. I mean, it just, the numbers didn't even add up. It was just, but it was glossy and it had a great name on it.
Pictures of happy people.
And I said to one of the lobbyists, I said, this stuff just doesn't make any sense. This is just, this is garbage. He said, it doesn't matter. He said, what we do is we go see a congressman, we give him something like this, and his staff gives him 2 sentences to say on the floor about why he can, be with us on this. And he thinks it looks good, and it kind of looks good, and it just gives him something that is defensible. And, he doesn't know what the carried interest is. He probably doesn't even know what capital gains treatment is, for all we know. So let me ask you each one question. What's your annual budget, Nick?
$3 million.
What could you do with $6 million? And don't say twice as much.
We would probably we could increase our Hills legislative staff tenfold, and then have enough money left over to launch a decent-sized advocacy campaign in New Hampshire and Iowa to try to get fixing the political system on the radar for 2020.
Sheila, what about you? What's your annual budget now?
Annual budget is about 2.2 million, and what we could do with additional funds would be to supercharge the dark money sleuthing. We're extending our work following these non-disclosing nonprofits to the state level, so we're working with our first state, but we'd like to expand that, so this pilot project could be extended to all the states where the dark money is definitely flowing in as we speak. Personal financial disclosures. We know that there's a lot of personal enrichment in the executive branch that is comparatively more, and we'd like to expand our research on that. That is an unfunded project at this point. And finally, tracking the both donors and candidates who are newly engaged, particularly women. There's so much energy, both in terms of female candidates running, female donor organizations getting involved, and we're tracking now a new project to track both the gender and race of candidates to bring to bear data that does not yet exist.
Before I ask Dennis, just think of the amazing leverage here. A couple $1 million, $2-3 million. I think when I was writing the part of the book where I put what your annual budget was, I happened to be reading the Politico Playbook that day, and there was just a little note. I think it was, Chevron had announced a new congressional PAC that had raised, and it was like the exact amount of money of your annual budget. So
maybe I should call them.
It's amazing how far they go with their money. And what's your
So we're at 3 million. If we had 3 million more, we'd put $1 million into increasing our substantive staff so that we could have expertise in more areas. We'd spend $1 million doing what Nick just alluded to, which is injecting our issues into the congressional and presidential races. And we'd spend $1 million in building a grassroots kind of membership to support the substantive work we're doing here.
So if any of you don't give money to these people, you should feel really bad. And if you do, you should double it.
Everybody with an extra million, raise your hand.
Just one last note before we take some questions. The book has a picture section. Now, the reason I think of that and the reason it's relevant is at one point, my assistant asked each of them to send a picture or where we could get a good picture of you. I mean, Sheila emailed me saying, you really shouldn't do that. I'm not the story. The story is the issue. I really believe that these people are the story because it takes people to have the resilience that is necessary and is going to be necessary. And they are a big part of my book because they really are a story. They are a redeeming story about this country. And I just want to thank you for being here.
Steve, will you come on our funder visits with us in the
No.
future?
Only if each donor has to buy 100 books.